Good day, everyone, and welcome to the SRC's ultra special lunchtime chat today on International Women's Day. Welcome to all of you women and to all of you men as well who want to participate in this session that celebrates women and looks at women in trade in particular. My name is Dr. Jani Remy. I am director of the Srinath Rampal Center for International Trade, Law, Policy, and Services right here at the Cahill campus at the University of the West Indies, Barbados. We have a real packed agenda for you today, and so I will speak for a very short time and go very quickly on to the next item. But I just wanted to welcome you all, welcome our panelists, welcome also our special speakers. But today the moment actually is with Dame Billy Miller, and we are going to start on the right foot by introducing Dame Billy Miller and paying tribute to her, a woman who we have designated as the recipient of the SRC's inaugural award for breakthrough women, women who have broken through the glass in the field of international trade. Without further ado, I'm going to start the tribute and ask our IT experts to start the tribute with a video from Barbados. Barbados and Barbadians want to thank Dame Billy Miller for everything she has done in the field of women and women's rights and trade.
My dear friends, I'm delighted that the board and staff of the Srinath Rampal Center have decided to honor my dear, dear friend, Dame Billy, through voices of her colleagues, mentees, and admirers. I'm pleased, as I said, to be part of that chorale that recognizes her contributions in the field of international trade, but I dare say it was much wider than that. Dame Billy is a Barbadian living legend of her time. From politics to access to healthcare for women and girls, from representing Barbados at the highest level as foreign minister to serving as a mentor for many of us in the current Barbados cabinet, Dame Billy has contributed immensely to building our country, the country that we know today. She has given her life to the service of Barbadians with an absolute special love for the city of Bridgetown. For that and for me, that is even more special, as both my father and grandfather represented that constituency. From an early age, Dame Billy showed an interest in politics and people. She herself was a product of her family, with her father being in that first cabinet in the Barbados government. But even she may not have anticipated the achievements that she would come to own. The third ever woman to be elected to the Parliament of Barbados in 1976. The first woman ever to sit in the cabinet of Barbados. The first woman ever to be leader of the House of Assembly. The first woman ever to be Minister of Health and National Insurance, Minister of Education, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Trade and International Business, Minister of Tourism, and indeed, my friends, our first woman ever to be Deputy Prime Minister. Dame Billy's legacy is as rich as it is varied. From her brave tabling of the medical termination bill almost 40 years ago that gave priority to women's right to choose and women's health care, to her determination to incorporate foreign affairs and foreign trade as a complementary portfolio, which we still do today. From her pioneering work in Bridgetown that led to it being recognized as a World Heritage Site, to her support for the building of polyclinics across this island to ensure that healthcare was accessible to all Barbadians, to her international roles in the Commonwealth, the ACP, the United Nations Population Fund, and indeed the Caribbean Tourism Organization. Billy's contribution, my friends, has been extensive. As a politician, her debating skills are second to none. Indeed, I find myself quoting her more and more as I go through this job. As a foreign minister, she helped to place Barbados on the global map through her work with the ACP and her continued support for the United Nations. and the role that small island developing states could play in that multilateral context. The United Nations House that we celebrate and use all the time is another part of her legacy, bringing the then Secretary General Kofi Annan here to open that house at the turn of the millennium. Indeed, let me say that one of her major achievements is also the recognition of being able to stay there as a strong and competent foreign minister for 14 years, one of the longest serving foreign ministers in the Commonwealth of Nations. My friends, this did not all happen by accident. It is almost as if Billy's future contributions were written in the stars. As I said, she came from a family of politicians and parliamentarians, but she also came from a family of entrepreneurs and nurses. In her career, she has been able to mix all of these influences to create a footprint that has stood the test of time. As a fellow lawyer, she was also someone I admired, given that at one point she was the only woman in Barbados practicing at the private bar. Yes, the only one. She took many of us young aspiring politicians under her wing when we wanted that guidance and mentorship, and she never lost patience with us, especially the ladies among us. She advised us, she mentored us, and she supported us. And I continue to be grateful for Billy's wise and astute stewardship and mentorship. I've seen it continue even as she has stepped away from politics, from helping to shape the future foreign trade minds in the region through her work with the University of the West Indies, to her commitment to maternal health and chairing of local organizations such as BARP. Dame Billy has continued to give service to this country. And in all of this, my friends, she has never forgotten her roots as a strong and devout Methodist. And indeed, if you know Billy Miller, you cannot divorce her from that strong faith which she has. My friends, for this all, we thank her. Indeed, I thank her. Let me join the Sridath Rampal Center in paying tribute to this great Barbadian woman who has helped shape so many of us and has thereby shaped our dear country, Barbados, for the better. Billy, we love you. Stay strong, stay healthy, and continue to inspire us. Thank you.
Happy International Women's Day 2022. This year, I joined so many others around the world in celebrating phenomenal women. We have a phenomenal woman this year right here among us. She is none other than former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade who has served in the government of Barbados for many, many years. She's a pioneer in diplomacy, a pioneer in particular on this occasion in bringing international trade expertise into the government of Barbados through the establishment in partnership with the University of the West Indies of the Sridath Rampal Center for Trade Policy and Trade Law. Dame Billy Miller, those of us who came through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade at a time where this was not a reality, but who were able to be witness and active participants in its execution, certainly in my case, by one, becoming an officer in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade during your tenure as minister. Secondly, being able to benefit from the training offered to officers who were interested in pursuing careers in international trade. And then subsequently, joining the board right along with you, one of our exemplary pioneers on the Sridath Rampal Center, has been a phenomenal journey that I have been able to have a first-hand seat to witness. I want to celebrate you today, Dame Billy Miller, as an extraordinary woman on this International Women's Day. You've paved the way for people like me and so many others to have careers in international trade and to have access to education, and also, more importantly, to own our agency and our voice as strong, competent, professional women. Happy International Women's Day to you, Dame Billy Miller. You are truly a phenomenal, exemplary woman.
I deem myself fortunate to have joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Barbados under the leadership of Dame Billy Miller. She set the tone for how we defended and pursued the interests of Barbados. We were expected to be bold and creative while maintaining the highest professional standards and always ensuring that we carried out our duties with integrity and dignity. It is often said that Barbados and Barbadians punch above our weight. No one best exemplified this than Dame Billy. We all bore witness to her strong defense of the interests of small island developing states in the halls of the United Nations and her advocacy for small states at the Commonwealth and WTO. Dame Billy, thank you so much for setting such a high bar for us to follow and for being such an excellent role model and mentor for all of us. We owe you an enormous debt of gratitude. I thank you.
Dame Billy Miller is a true craft person of Barbados' development. She's a fierce believer in multilateralism and the power of trade, but equally she knows that for foreign policy and trade to work, it must place the individual at the center. This was why she helped shape a Barbados feminist foreign policy before it became fashionable, why she merged foreign trade and foreign affairs into one ministry, and why she focused so much of her work on the rights of women, children, and vulnerable populations. Many of us who have made international politics and international relations our chosen career path have been privileged to be under the tutelage of Dame Billy. Her influence and service knows no partisanship. From small states to WTO engagement to commitment to the United Nations to a people-centered approach to policy, this is the legacy she has left on foreign policy. Her commitment to mentorship cannot be overstated. She understands that there's no expiry date on learning and on mentoring. There's only ever one first. Dame Billy is an original, and I'm so privileged to call her a mentor, and dare I say, a friend.
Thank you so much to all of those who contributed, not least the Prime Minister of Barbados, for these wonderful words. And thank you to Matthew Wilson and Jermaine Atwell for helping with the production of this video together with the SRC team. I'm not going to say any more, so much has said, but my principal is going to make some brief remarks just because Dame Billy served for 9 years as a board member of the Srinath Ramphal Center. So a few words from the principal, and then the floor is yours for your brief response, Dame Billy. Over to you again, Sam.
On the occasion of International Women's Day, on the theme, Break the Bias, it is my pleasure on behalf of the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus to bring our tribute to a remarkable woman, Dame Billy Antoinette Miller, whose achievements in public life are surely the apotheosis on the theme, as she broke the bias over and over again. I wish to highlight her first 2 ministerial portfolios in health and education respectively that exemplified how she was able to break the bias in public life. For a start, when she first took her seat in the House of Assembly, Billy Miller was not only the youngest member of Parliament at the tender age of 32, but remained the only female member of Parliament for the next 18 years of her public life. Billy Miller brought a fresh woman's perspective into her ministerial portfolios, which axiomatically made her a transformative leader. As Minister of Health, she introduced the polyclinics into the healthcare system, thereby shifting the emphasis from interventional medicine to preventive medicine, entirely in keeping with modern best practice and very practical from a woman's perspective as the primary caregivers of most households. In the Ministry of Education, she again fostered the crucial linkage between the home environment and the school system by enshrining parent-teacher organizations into the new Education Act post-independence. Time does not permit a more fulsome exploration of Dame Billy's decisive interventions in public life. But let me add, from the perspective of the Cave Hill campus, our deepest appreciation for her long-standing service as board member of the Srinath Ramphal Center for International Trade Law, Policy and Services, where she contributed her unrivaled experience from postings in foreign affairs, foreign trade and tourism for the advancement of the Academy. Dame Billie Antoinette Miller, bias breaker extraordinaire, the UWI Cave campus salutes you.
Dave Billy, we wanted to use the opportunity, although you're not with us here in this room, all of the staff, the management, and the board, on behalf of all of them, let me present this to you, our first ever Women for an International Trade Award from the SRC for your outstanding pioneering service in international trade. Over to you. You may be muted, Dame Billy, we can't hear you. You may need to unmute.
Apology.
Yes.
Yes, I'm saying thank you very much. Excuse me. Hello. No.
I think you're muted again, Dave Billy.
No, I'm unmuted now. Yes. I wanted to say that I am truly touched that the Sridhar Ramphal Center had decided to honor me in this way during the week that we celebrate and place a spotlight on the role of women. There may come a time one day when we no longer need a special International Women's Day to recognize how far we have come, but how far we still have to go. But until that day comes, I applaud you for particularly commemorating women and trade and women in trade. We know the statistics. During the pandemic, women's employment declined by almost 4.5%. That is more than 55 million jobs. We know that it will take 136 years to close the global agenda gap. We know that over 50% of women do not yet have access to the internet. And we know that violence against women and girls, especially domestic violence, continues to rise. These are issues we must face head on. These are issues you on the panel today, the next generation, that's how I see you, must solve these overbearing issues. But we also know that the voices of women are increasingly being heard. We celebrate the innovation of small women-owned businesses all over the world and their resilience during the pandemic. We know that some WTO members, including Barbados, will be supporting a new gender and trade declaration at the June ministerial conference. I still note with pride that the heads of the 3 trade-related institutions in Geneva are led by women. I'm not shocked by it. And closer to home, I'm delighted to see the unparalleled representation of women in the Senate, and that we again have a woman deputy prime minister. And of course, our first president is a woman. These are occasions to be marked, but we must never take our eyes off the prize: true and representative gender equality. At a more personal and professional level, I'm honored to have contributed in some small part to showing that women have every right to sit in Parliament as men do. The women can be deputy prime ministers and lead the Senate. That women can be foreign affairs and foreign trade ministers. That women can lead trade negotiations. That we can sit on global boards and contribute and lead from the front. That a feminist foreign policy is not one that focuses only on women and gender equality, but rather one that understands that people, our citizens, are ultimately at the center of our domestic and foreign policy decisions. I look around me this week at a world in turmoil. And I think, what if the president of Russia was a woman? Would this be happening? I don't think so. I am proud of my family. My mother was a caregiver and an exemplary nurse midwife. My father was an entrepreneur and minister of government, as you've heard. From them, I've taken a deep passion for the health of women and girls and a commitment to serve. That's how I have always seen myself, and I still do see myself in that way, to serve my country. I have been fiercely committed to Barbados from the moment I entered politics. At that time, there were not that many examples of women embarking on that journey, but here is another lesson I learned. Men, secure men, can sometimes be our greatest supporters. From Grantley Adams to Bernard St. John and Tom Adams to Owen Arthur, these men understood that together we would have the greatest impact. They understood that to lift a woman was to lift the society. That is how I believe they saw me. One of my greatest experiences was serving the people of my constituency, the beloved city of Bridgetown, and helping to rejuvenate this historical town to make it a hub for trade, tourism, and investment. A close second must be my time as Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, where I quickly recognized that for small states in the Caribbean, there was very little difference between domestic policy and foreign policy. They must be mutually reinforcing, even now. This is also why I'm so proud to see so many of my former Foreign Service officers, Selwyn Hart, Minister Lisa Cummings, Matthew Wilson, on that beautiful commemoration video. It gives me great comfort to know that this generation will continue to represent Barbados with integrity and with confidence. I have saved my final word for Prime Minister Mia Amo-Motley. I am deeply honored that you have taken the time, ma'am, to record your thoughts. Barbados could not be in better hands as we face the choppy waters ahead. I well remember when her mother said to me one day, "My daughter is 15 years old and she wants to be doing what you are doing." And I said to her, she can come around to my house next Saturday morning and we'll talk. And we still talk. The work you are doing in building, thank you. I want to say a special thank you to Executive Director now, Dr. Genevieve Remy, her team, and the board of the Sridhar Ramphal Center for today's surprising, but I have to say, oh so appreciated honor. The work you are doing in building the next generation of trade and development actors in the region is absolutely critical. Ladies, I leave it in your hands. I thank you.
Oh, that was heartwarming. Wonderful words, heartwarming words. A bit of a gauntlet to all of us to carry on what you have started. And thank you for blessing us, gracing us with your presence, your foresight. And we hope that you keep coming around the SRC to inspire us. So thank you very much. And I hope you stay on for the rest of today's activities.
Oh, I shall.
Wonderful. Big supporter of the SRC.
I wouldn't miss it.
At this point, let us move to Geneva. We have been graced with the presence of Ms. Nicole Mensah, development economist and social entrepreneur who is passionate about women's empowerment and who currently serves as the advisor to the Director General of the WTO on matters of women and trade. Ms. Mensah, thank you for traveling all the way to the Caribbean. A few words to open our roundtable. Over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Her Excellency Dame Billy Miller, Professor Janives, Remy, ladies and gentlemen. I bring you greetings from Geneva and from Dr. Kunjo Iweala, Director General of the WTO. It's an honor to be here today speaking at the West Indies, at the University of the West Indies. Firstly, because I feel as if I'm a beneficiary, and I am a beneficiary of Dame Billy Miller's legacy. And secondly, because the West Indies has great relevance to me, as my great-great-grandparents were missionaries from the West Indies who settled in Ghana. So thank you for having me. Today is International Women's Day, and as we discuss women and the contribution they make to the global economy, it's essential that we also examine the role of women in trade and how this role can be strengthened to boost economic growth. Women have been involved in trade for millennia, though they have often worked behind the scenes within domestic markets rather than regional and global markets. For many women, trade is associated with higher economic empowerment and higher wages. In a study that I conducted in northern Ghana with 800 women involved in the shea butter industry, women who worked in cooperatives that exported their goods regionally and internationally were more empowered and made 2 times more money than women who sold shea butter locally. This increased wealth had a positive effect on overall investment in the health and education of both the women and their children. So when women trade, economies benefit. Despite this, globally, women are often overrepresented in informal jobs and non-tradable sectors, and only 1 in 5 export firms is owned or managed by a woman. In many other sectors, women have been disenfranchised from fully participating in and benefiting from trade. And though several strides have been made to close the gender gap, the pandemic has unfortunately had a disproportionate impact on women as they continue to make up the majority of frontline workers. Women entrepreneurs also faced a combination of small business vulnerability and heavy industry sector impacts, whilst also carrying the additional burden of family care. A 2021 survey by the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor found that globally, women were 20% more likely than men to report a business closure due to the pandemic. The ILO reports that globally, between 2019 and 2020, while men's employment declined by 3%, women's employment declined by 4.2%. Trade is a big part of the economic recovery story. And as we work towards returning to our new normal after the pandemic, we must build back better. And building back better means building back greener, more equitably, and more inclusively, especially within the global trade industry. With a 10.8% growth rate in merchandise trade last year and projected 4.7% this year, we must work tirelessly to make sure that women are also at the center of trade and of this economic recovery. And with our changing global economy, we have the opportunity to do just that. One such opportunity can be found in the services sector. World Bank data shows that in 2017, over 66% of women were employed in the services sector, up from 45% in 1991. In developing countries, 38% of women were employed in the services sector, compared to 25% in 1991. As we build back better, it's important to prepare women and young girls now to enter the services sector, and that includes training and building their capacity. Another fast-growing sector is in the area of e-commerce and digitalization. Here also, as highlighted in the UNCTAD Declaration, There should be a concerted effort, and that is programs and concessions, to encourage women to fully immerse themselves in the digital world, which allows many of them to bypass many of the existing traditional trade barriers and leverage a much wider audience. A McKinsey study in Indonesia found that women involved in e-commerce businesses were making 2 times that of their counterparts involved in traditional commerce. In the WTO, we found that up to 28% of traditional small businesses exported their goods, compared to 97% of internet-enabled small businesses. We must support women to access the economic opportunities that e-commerce provides. Finally, as countries become more integrated with global value chains, we have another opportunity to advocate for and ensure higher employment and increased wages for women. At the WTO, under the leadership of the Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, we are working to put women at the forefront of our work. In December 2021, the Joint Initiative of Services Domestic Regulation was concluded by 67 WTO members. The agreement seeks to facilitate services trade worldwide by improving the business climate, lowering trade costs, and cutting down on red tape. This is a historic agreement because for the first time in the WTO's existence, an agreement included a provision on non-discrimination between men and women, thereby increasing women's participation in services trade. Building on our Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade and Gender, as Dame Billy Miller has already mentioned, in June of this year, the WTO Informal Working Group on Trade and Gender will be launching its ministerial declaration on the advancement of gender equality and women's economic empowerment within trade. The declaration highlights the importance of and encourages members to, among other things, collect gender disaggregated data that can help create more inclusive gender responsive trade policies, and to devise a 2-year work plan that examines the pandemic and considers the women's place in the recovery. On a more practical side, we are also collaborating more with the ITC, and we are currently in conversation about a $50 million trade and gender fund, leveraged 4-to-1, to support WTO members to translate commitments to gender equality and women's empowerment into tangible results and impact for women on the ground, helping them to scale up the work they are already doing and expand both regionally and internationally. I am pleased to say that the work that we are doing at the WTO is in line with the recommendations of the UNCTAD Declaration. This declaration mandates members to apply a gender lens to all aspects of their trade and economic policies. But beyond the declaration, we must find a way to hold both ourselves and member states accountable to these commitments, such that by 2030, the numbers will tell their story. Thank you once again for having me today, and I look forward to further discussions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Menza. What a wonderful way to open. And I also noted at the beginning, you said that your forebears came from Ghana. Well, or from Ghana. And I would note that our Prime Minister of Barbados just this weekend was in Ghana celebrating with your
Yes.
your Ghanaian compatriots, 65 years of independence. So there's so much more that links us.
Yes.
And we are so assured that with you advising the DG, I've heard about the work you're doing also at the ITC, the work you did with women in Ghana on shea butter, that the fate of women in trade is in very good hands. So thanks for gracing us with your presence, and all our best to your DG and the cabinet in forcing through for MC12. Thank you so much. Without further ado, I really need to pass on to my colleague to start the roundtable discussion and leave you in her capable hands. Ms. Chelsea Brathwaite, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that introduction, Dr. Remy. I'm delighted to be here among such an esteemed panel of accomplished women. So to provide a very brief introduction for the sake of our audience, I'm joined by Amrita Barry, who's the Associate Professor at Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, Roberto Clark, who's the Commissioner of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Vashti Guedin, the CEO of Trinidad and Tobago Coalition of Services Industries, who you may not see at the moment on the screen because she's in and out, but she will join us as soon as she can, and Shadia Gemma, attorney at law and consultant. I want to thank you all for taking the time to be here with us today. No, because time is really limited and I really want to learn from you guys today and get the most out of this discussion. I'm just going to briefly contextualize today's roundtable and then we'll jump right into the discussion. So during the 15th session of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which was hosted here in Barbados last year, there was the inaugural Gender and Development Forum, which culminated with the declaration. That declaration, which by the way for our audience is publicly available, called for UNTAD to address more comprehensively the gender dimensions of trade and development, noting that the Bridgetown Covenant should, one, facilitate the full and meaningful participation of women in the formation of policies nationally, regionally, and internationally. Two, ensure that gender justice is embedded in all policies and practices informed by intersectional feminist analysis. Three, promote gender justice as intrinsic to trade policy. Four, commit to gender inclusiveness in the development of digital trade. And finally, address the persistent and emerging challenges of developing countries in pursuing stable economic growth and achieving inclusive and sustainable development, informed by a commitment to gender justice and respect for the fragility of the environment and for indigenous knowledge and technologies. So against that backdrop, I believe we can get the ball rolling. So my first question to this lovely panel is, as we saw, there's an entire declaration dedicated to gender and trade. But why is gender and trade such an important topic for not only women, but for everyone? Is there a unique skill set or perspective that women bring to trade and to trade negotiations? Anyone can feel free to have a go at this one.
Good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I think that we have an arrangement on the questions, so I'll jump in. But before I do, I just want to join in the appreciation of Dame Billy. If you will permit me just 1 minute of that. I come from a Barbadian family with its share of very, very strong women who are hardworking, steely, determined, they're stoics, they're plain speaking, they're dynamic, and none more so than Dame Billy. Back in 1973, Billy, I don't know if you probably will not recall, or 74, I made an appointment to interview you for a newspaper at Queen's College called Breakthrough. At that time, you had already been breaking all the barriers and you did agree for me to interview you. I was been 13 or 14, and already at that time you had such presence and, you know, quite inspiring. And I think that you've inspired many all through the years, not only in your demeanor, but in your determination to make a difference. So just thank you for that, and happy to be in this session with you. So yes, your question is, why is gender and trade such an important topic, not only for women, but for everyone? I want to just start off by saying that we speak a lot about economic growth and inclusive development, but for those of us who work in social justice and in the feminist movement, there's a big difference for us, you know, between the two. And we reiterate it all the time, and the difference matters. So economic growth speaks to an increase in national income and in national output, but not necessarily how this income is distributed or redistributed, neither who has access to what resources to participate in generating income and output. So economic development for us, which is a more relevant concept, is concerned with the improvement in the quality of life and the living conditions for the many and not just for the few. And increasingly, given the existential crises that we are confronting, embedded in the concept of economic development is the notion of sustainability and ecological balance. That, and you will see from the declaration from this inaugural Gender and Development Forum, the rapid production and consumption patterns which have and continue to deplete non-renewable resources and which contributes to the alteration of the climate must be contained. So those of us who do this work on gender and trade and gender development are not just concerned about gender equality, but how our participation can change the paradigm of development. So we understand that economic growth is important for generating income and resources, but we're also conscious that growth itself has not led to equal development. And so in countries like the Caribbean, and we have a particular history, which I think we share with many colonized countries around the world, we were reduced to producers of primary products, such as monoagriculture. And as a result, forced to import almost everything else that we needed. Those terms of an equal exchange generated tremendous profits for few, and particularly in the global north, and resulted in the limited economic development and persistent poverty and inequality that we see really all around the Caribbean, notwithstanding some progress. Of course, we've had progress. So we can describe the situation as severely distortive. Caribbean countries spend significant sums on importing food, even whilst we have so much land, and buying fuel, even whilst the sun shines brightly all throughout the year. So for us, the feminist scholarship has highlighted that whilst there's a commonality of experience of that underdevelopment, women were and are affected in different ways because of the intersecting factor of gender and sex-based discrimination in the productive and the care economies. So notwithstanding the progress in education and the achievements in the labor force, our participation in the labor market is still characterized by segmentation, in which women are more likely than men to be in the informal economy, underpaid, working in exploitative conditions, and women continue to have difficulty accessing finance, and many remain in small-scale industries, often retail as opposed to production. And alongside this, an equal and precarious insertion in the productive economy, Caribbean women bear the weight of the care in the home, care for children, care for the elderly, care for the sick, and they do so in an invisible way largely, and it's unremunerated and not necessarily, when I say unremunerated, it also is not taken into account in national insurance schemes or in social protection schemes, so really unremunerated and invisible. And so what feminist activism brings to gender and trade discussion is this focus on social justice. And it was something I was reading very recently that Dame Billy said in her presentation, a presentation to the General Assembly in 2005, that material development must align itself to social justice goals. And that really is, I think, why it's important for all of us to be engaging in gender and trade, because it's a way of saying we have to engage in ensuring that trade redresses past inequalities and creates opportunities for all. So I think those of us who are concerned with gender and trade are concerned with justice, we're concerned with equality, and we're concerned with sustainable development. And we bring that conscience, I call it conscience, to the thinking and action around gender and trade. I have other things I can say, but I'll stop now.
Thank you for that, Roberta. And on that note of trade addressing past inequalities, my question then to Rita and Vashti, if she's been able to join us, is that there's a survey from the International Trade Center that revealed that only 1 in 5 exporting firms are led by female entrepreneurs, and that women-owned or managed exporting firms are less likely to engage in imports compared to their male counterparts. So overall, the findings are suggesting that far fewer women are engaged in international trade than men. So against this backdrop, what are some of the barriers that women, especially young women, face in trade?
Thank you for the question. I just want to start by saying that when I woke up this morning, I was questioning myself, how do I make this day stand out? And what feature of my Women's Day this year should stand out really for me? And I think I've got my answer. I'm extremely, extremely honored and pleased to be here amongst and having the opportunity of talking to such inspiring leaders, female leaders, like Dame Billy, Nicole, Dr. Remy, and others. So thank you for having me on board. To answer to the question, women face different kinds of barriers, and it depends upon whether we are looking at women as employees, consumers, and business stakeholders. And these barriers mainly emerge from the disadvantages they face in the economic, social, financial, and regulatory ecosystems they operate in. The disadvantages may include lack of access to educational opportunities, including business training, digital divide between men and women caused by lack of affordability and digital know-how, lack of access to productive resources such as finances, land, and other assets, disproportionately high tariffs and non-tariff barriers faced by women-owned businesses, lack of trade-related information and business networks, and disproportionately high burden to discharge household responsibilities, and increasing domestic violence. And as the UNCTAD Declaration has clearly indicated, the crisis of COVID-19 has exacerbated the impact of these pre-existing challenges for women-owned businesses. As Dame Billy rightly pointed out, the pandemic, the health crisis, the global health crisis has put women to the forefront of the struggle. A follow-up to that is, can trade agreements help? Can they address some of these barriers? Well, the short answer, I think, is yes. Trade agreements can empower women and help them mitigate the barriers they currently face, mainly for two reasons. First, the existing and future trade agreements can increase trade flows, so they can lead to more business opportunities and employment opportunities for women. And second, through trade agreements, countries can encourage their trade partners to reduce trade barriers and create more employment conducive and business conducive environment for women to work and engage and access economic opportunities. There are plenty of examples in existing trade agreements that seek to enhance women's access to finance and many other economic opportunities and reduce their barriers. So clearly trade agreements, trade policies can help, but there are no magic bullets, and they can come with their own challenges, their own problems. And we can probably discuss about these problems in the follow-up discussions and questions.
Right, thank you for that, Amrit. And I see, Vashti, you've been able to join us back. I don't know if you want to take a stab at that one, just to repeat it. We were looking at the fact that findings overall are suggesting that far fewer women are engaged in international trade than men. So we wanted to know what are some of the barriers that women, especially young women, face in trade, and how can trade agreements address some of these barriers, if at all?
Thanks so much. Again, my apologies. I just had to run into a quota meeting. And again, our experience at the TTCSI and even at the Caribbean export level, we have had over the last 3.5 years, we have been pushing heavily an export drive. And so we have completed over the last 3 years, Services Go Global, and out of 350 participants, and I'm not just talking about Trinidad and Tobago, it's persons from regionally, roughly 7 islands, and 80% of those participants were female entrepreneurs. But here's what, out of the 80% of participants, who only 15% have been able to complete and implement their export plan. So when we drill deeper in terms of why didn't you implement that export plan, and in most instances, it has been because they have not been able to access finance. They have not been able to make a breakthrough with the commercial bank, or if they have, the collateral is not the collateral that the bank identifies. Because normally in the Caribbean, a deed, land is owned by men. So that is a difficulty that they are facing. Now, Amrita spoke about some of the barriers, but I've been working closely with these women, and I have to say, we are not addressing some of the softer issues, which is that, and because most of these women are professional women, they don't talk about it, but they are facing issues at home because they may be shining more than their spouse. So I have had a couple women tell me it's either I export or expand my business or I lose the father of my children. So these are some of the issues that we have not addressed as female entrepreneurs. So what we are looking at the TTCSI is what we are trying to form a network, because there's a strong network for male business people, but we don't have a strong network for female entrepreneurs. And I have one of my past presidents who is an excellent networker. And she would say that if you are not networking, you are not working. So what we are trying at the TTCSI is to introduce building the sisterhood of exporters, whereby female entrepreneurs could communicate, and those issues that they are not willing to share, they have mentors within that network that can mentor them and help alleviate some of these barriers. And again, one of the barriers is confidence, is that they do not have confidence in themselves that, you know what, I could expand my business, I could trade not just regionally, but internationally.
Thank you for that, Ashley. And I completely agree with you. And when you were speaking about that fact of having limited networks, it caused me to go to ways that we can actually empower females and overcome these constraints. And I thought immediately of digital trade and e-commerce. And I know in the room we have Shade Jama, who has worked in this space quite a bit. So my question then to her would be, digital trade and e-commerce has been touted as an available avenue for the economic empowerment of women, primarily due to its ability to overcome time and mobility constraints, some of which Vashi would have spoken to just now, when women often have to decide between balancing family life and balancing work life. However, the declaration itself speaks to the growing digital divide where women around the world lag behind men in their access to modern technologies. How can we close this divide in order to better integrate women into the international trade landscape?
Thank you. I think that that's an excellent question. And I'd like to approach it by firstly pointing out the fact that even as the world becomes more digital and we're implementing more technology, a lot of the fundamentals remain the same. Ultimately, that's the answer to the question in a nutshell. The fundamentals remain the same, and we ultimately still have those challenges, the same challenges that we're talking about when we talk about breaking the bias, those that exist regardless of the realm of operation. Before I go any further, I really want to take the opportunity to echo the sentiments of my fellow panelists in congratulating Dame Billy Miller this afternoon, sorry. Certainly for me, you are a legend, and it is a great privilege to be with you and these other esteemed ladies here this afternoon. From my perspective, I think it's really important to acknowledge that generally speaking, not just in a trade context, but generally speaking, to navigate the world as a woman is to be constantly reminded of the imperative for inclusivity and equity. And that's why we even need initiatives such as International Women's Day, because we need to shine a bright light not only on the strides that have been made, but also how much further we have left to go. So even as we commemorate today the social, political, and economic achievements of women, and we're putting this in the context of trade, and we're even advocating for equal treatment and representation, and these fights that we are fighting on multiple levels in different spaces, I think it's important to see, even this theme of break the bias as both a call to action and a promise of sustainable development, empowerment, and above all, opportunity. And if you're going to facilitate women in trade and really address the fundamentals, you have to identify and confront the barriers to entry and to growth that are both seen and unseen, formal and informal. So for example, we need to acknowledge that there still in 2022 are gender norms that dictate that facilitating women in trade includes considering and facilitating healthcare, childcare, equipping their romantic partners with the tools to support and help them navigate their entrepreneurial journeys and the demands that come from being a woman in trade. And for example, the other sides of that challenge where, for example, you have mother's guilt in the fact that you have to lean in. You know, some people say that you have to work as a woman twice as hard to get half as far. That's a reality. And if you have to work twice as hard to get half as far in the same 24 hours, and you have a child on top of that, and society is saying to you, mothers behave a particular way, partners show up in relationships in a particular way, you know, those are some of the more informal challenges. So I know that you've asked about technology and dealing with the divide. This morning, I had the opportunity to moderate a discussion on behalf of 10 Habitat. And we had Marla Dukaran on that panel. And Marla shared a statistic that to me was quite shocking, that in this region, women invest about 90% of their earnings back into the family and back into the community. And in comparison, men invest about 40%. So when you think about that, you could appreciate the imperative for, for example, why women may not be able to participate from a technological perspective on the same level as men, but also you appreciate the imperative of facilitating women in trade, because the more women trade, the more the community benefits.
Thank you so much for that, Shadi. And I couldn't agree more. I just want to pause to see if any of the other panelists wanted to contribute to that question or anything that Shadi said so far before we move on to the next question. And Dame Billy Miller and Ms. Nicole Menji, you can also feel free to participate as well if you wanted to share some insights as we go on as well. All right. So moving along, earlier, Roberta, you would have spoken a lot about social justice, but throughout the declaration, there was this repeated mention of gender justice over and over. But for the sake of the audience and myself, what does that term really mean in the context of trade and development today? And is there a gender justice agenda that extends beyond gender sensitive trade policies? Because if you remember, Rita earlier said that, you know, these trade agreements, they're not going to be the magic bullet that solves it all.
Yes, thank you. Maybe I could just read maybe a short excerpt from the declaration for those who have not, don't know of it, who have not read it. So this declaration comes from the inaugural Gender and Development Forum, which was undertaken under the auspices of the UNCTAD in Barbados in 2021. And if you look at the declaration, it calls for what they say as what they call for the restoration, and I'm quoting now, of the primacy of gender justice over the economic goals of trade and investment policies. This includes, according to the declaration, a complete transformation of global macroeconomic governance, including the current trade and investment systems, towards one that is based on human rights, respect for life and ecosystems, and that advances sustainable development. Embedded in the declaration is, I think, an articulation that the governing macroeconomic structure, the dominant economic structure within which trade agreements are negotiated and concluded, are ones that are essentially contributing to the continued inequality or inequalities within and between countries. So they talk about gender justice, but what does this actually mean? Really, we are accustomed to speaking about gender equality and understanding that that means sort of ending all forms of discrimination against women, and now we understand also gender non-conforming people. But gender justice, I think, is something that is a little bit deeper and broader than gender equality. It's a recognition that equality with men, while important, does not in and of itself result in development or end all forms of oppression, particularly when we live in societies that are structured by other inequalities and in particular, socioeconomic inequality and poverty. So when we speak about gender justice, we are recognizing that women are not monolithic, and they experience multiple and overlapping sources of let's say, marginalization or exclusion, oppression, and or privilege, of course. So gender justice helps us to think in an intersectional way, centering the diverse needs and experiences of women and calling for the leadership of people, not just women, of people most impacted by gender and sex discrimination and oppression. And it's an approach, I think, that helps us focus both on equity, which is the equal distribution of resources, equal access to opportunities, as well as equal outcomes for all. So it's both process as well as outcome. And I think gender justice helps us to think about that. So what are the elements of gender justice? The previous speaker, I think it was Shadi, spoke about some of the barriers to women in trade. When we're thinking about gender justice, we're also thinking about affirmative policies to support women's productive enterprise, really importantly. And that's including, you know, of course, the inputs into production, access to financing, and anybody who tries to open a bank account now knows what that horror is all about, and really stymies small and medium-sized enterprises. But it also means not just finance, access to land, for example. Someone previously spoke about the titling. We still have, I think that's changing quite a bit in the Caribbean, but there's still the tradition of land being registered in the name of a man in a household. I think that's changing, but we still have some of that. And it's not just about the productive inputs, access to productive inputs. It's also about the support on the care economy side. Now, Shadi spoke about the majority. Anybody knows in the Caribbean, we know that, but the figures are really important. How much of women's income goes into the family, but just not just their income, all of their assets, their time assets, their care assets, their love assets, their psychological assets, a lot of that goes into the family. And as I said in the beginning, it's generally invisible, taken for granted, unrecognized, and unremunerated. And so I think when we think about policies that support production and productive enterprise, we also have to be thinking about a social protection scheme or social insurance scheme that recognizes that care economy. And I think in the declaration, you see a lot of reference to the interplay between the productive and the care economies. And I think that's really an important facet. Then we also think about trade rules that should not increase protections for multinational corporations, especially those who are avoiding taxes. We understand it's a hard road to, to row, as they say. We want to attract foreign direct investment. We want to make it as easy as possible, but all that can continue to recreate inequalities and also to oppress and diminish sort of local industry development. One of the things that I heard years ago in relation to Haiti, under the trade agreements that Haiti was part of, Haiti, one of the poorest countries in the world, they had to remove all of their protections, their tariff and non-tariff barriers. And that, in relation to rice production, Haiti was self-sufficient in rice production. They were forced to remove their protection on their rice. They got the subsidized rice from the United States, where the farmers are subsidized, flooding the rice market in Haiti, and they demolished the industry, the local industry. I think that was back then. I'm not sure what's happening now. So we also have to think carefully about the rules, how they protect multinational corporations, how they protect countries from the companies that come from the global north, and they undermine the environment for enterprise to grow. And of course, if you are, experiencing intersectional inequality, it's very hard for you to deal with the multiple levels of power in the global economy. And I think kind of really essentially thinking about trade policies that meet the sustainable needs of the countries. There's this concept, and those of you who are trade specialists can tell us a lot more about it. Globalization was really meant to ease the movement of capital. And it's kind of a race to the bottom where they keep talking about the comparative advantage. So your comparative advantage is cheap labor. How would you ever develop like that, right? So we talk about challenging the macroeconomic, the political economy at the macro and macroeconomics at the global level. And I suppose that's what we're talking about when we say gender justice. It's not just adding women to the pot and stirring, but changing the shape of the pot, changing what you do with the pot. Thanks.
So on that note, in terms of not just adding women to the pot, but changing the pot, My question then going over to one of the trade experts, Vashti. According to the declaration, the world's women are demanding a radical restructuring of multilateralism and the global political economy to ensure that the benefits of the world's resources accrue to the majority and not the few. So I want to spend some time then addressing what this radical restructuring, in your opinion, would look like and the tools needed to achieve the goals outlined in the declaration and some of the factors that Roberta would have just mentioned as well.
Sure, Chelsea. That was indeed a mouthful. And I have to say, I started off my career in academia, employed at the Arthur Lockjack Global School of Business. And following that, I went on to the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber. And in essence, I had to relearn everything when I started working at the chamber, because that statement, if I were to go to the private sector, they will say, what exactly do you mean by that? So let's dissect this. In essence, what I think we are trying to, why isn't it working for women? Because most women are employed in the services sector. Just at the hotel meeting that I was at before, roughly the services sector account for 66% of GDP regionally. Roughly 70% of the services sector in the region are owned and operated by women. But here's what, the institutions that we have in place that govern services have been designed for manufacturing and for the energy sector. So obviously, it's not working. How do we know it's not working? Because most of the service providers, most of the females who operate in these industries operate in the informal sector. And here's what, it's not simply because they do not want to register their business, but the approach, the whole mechanism, the business processes are very archaic, because a micro or a small business owner cannot give up one full day. They are losing income if they have to go 2 and 3 times to register a business. So we need to address that. We need to look, when we talk about the radical shift, we need to look at the institutions that govern these, that govern the whole services sector. It has to be revamped. So that is what I think, that we need some radical shifts there, because it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, because what works for the manufacturing sector would not work for the services sector, because services, it's very diverse. What you have medical practitioners, you have woodworkers, it's very different. So the whole institutional arrangements has to be rethought.
Agreed. And I think, as you said, it needs to be radical. One thing that's pushed us to think more radically is this COVID-19 pandemic that we're still feeling the effects of. So my question to Amrita and Shade is, how has the pandemic affected women in trade? We've heard a bit about that from Ms. Nicole Menza at the start. But are there any lessons to be learned from coming out of this pandemic that we can use to better integrate women into the international trade landscape? And this discussion, if possible, I'd also like us to touch on the importance or the relevance of remote working policies for females. Rita, you can feel free to start, and then we'll hop over to Shadi.
Sure, thank you. So clearly, the pandemic has left us with various questions to think about. The global pandemic has made it clear that women stand disproportionately impacted in every crisis-like situation. This is not the first time, or this is not the first pandemic or crisis that has put the women to the forefront. We saw similar disproportionate impacts on women and their economic empowerment in the Ebola crisis, in the H1N1 and other health pandemics as well. This global pandemic has also made it clear that digital access is no longer a luxury, but an absolute necessity. And it has made it clear that there is an acute digital divide in terms of education, access to business opportunities between men and women, and between developing and developed countries. So going forward, I think it is important for private stakeholders and public stakeholders, for academicians, international organizations, and policymakers to work together, because this pandemic has posed challenges. But at the same time, I think it has given a golden opportunity to all of us to rethink, repackage, and somehow reconsider the ways in which we have carried out operating and we have regulated the governance of international trade with the help of multilateral trading system or with the help of regional or trade agreements. I think it has made us revisit the benefits vis-a-vis the costs that we are facing of free trade and liberalization. When we started with liberalization and free trade era about in the mid of 1990s, with the signing of NAFTA, there was a long-held promise that liberalization would increase employment opportunities and it would make life better for all. But it has created some clear winners, but it has also created losers. And I think it is important to acknowledge that now more than ever before, and formulate the future trade policies and negotiate future trade agreements, keeping that in mind.
Thank you, Amrita. Over to you, Shadi.
Well, Amrita has made my job in responding to this question very, very easy because she said so much of what needs to be said. The only thing I would seek to add at this point is that I think the pandemic has really amplified the challenges that existed before. And if we keep on taking it back to the fundamentals and taking it back to the individual, trade is not an end in and of itself, it's a means to an end. And that end that is a means to its development. And I really like what Ms. Clark said about not just adding women to the pot and stirring, you want to change the pot, as well as the distinction between economic growth and economic development. Because if you're really focusing on the development imperative of trade, you start to appreciate what the pandemic actually did. So you had a situation where women are carrying the mother load of care responsibility, that care economy, as was referred to by my fellow panelists. And we had a situation where people were on lockdown, children were at school remotely, leveraging technologies. The digital divide was amplified, not just for adults, but definitely for children. And you had a situation where women, in many cases, women who are the primary, are leading the households, especially in a Caribbean context. They're leading households and they are working full-time from home and also parenting full-time because the children are there. And that has an impact of amplifying the challenges that being the main caretakers in society actually places on women. So, and then on top of that, in the context of lockdowns and curfews, we saw that silent pandemic of increasing gender-based violence. And that is now layered on top of the other systemic challenges that present for women in across the spectrum, but in a trade context where we appreciate that trade is a means to an end, it really is particularly challenging. And I think it's emphasize that we need to make some systemic changes and to create the infrastructure to support, and also from a cultural perspective, that we have some cultural norms that need to evolve if we're ever going to be able to leverage trade in a Caribbean context to the extent that we need to, especially appreciating our particular family structures and the fact that oftentimes this burden is disproportionately carried across the genders, and even for gender non-conforming persons and persons who are marginalized largely in our society.
Speaking, Shadi, of those systemic issues, one of our viewers in the audience, they asked a question which goes, how can the stigma of women be completely eliminated? You know, this year the theme is breaking the bias. So we're seeing more women excelling in different fields, whether it's politics, leadership, trade negotiations, international business, etc. But that glass ceiling still has not been shattered. So they would like to know what's really needed to give that final push so that women can really be meaningful contributors in all segments of society, not only in trade, and get a greater visibility as well. And that's for anyone as well. Go ahead.
Madam Chair, if I may, I'm afraid I have to leave you now. And thank you all again. I'm not going to forget today.
Thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.
I appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Back to you, Shadia.
Well, if I can just build on what I was just saying, I think ultimately we have to have those tough conversations. You know, I'm constantly being told in my day-to-day work that, you know, women have arrived, right? We have, especially in the Barbadian context, we have a prime minister, a president, a DPP, you know, women are occupying all these political spaces, for example, and therefore the fight has been won. And I think that almost the success that we have achieved in certain spaces is a limitation, operates to limit the progress we can make in others, because there is this perception that, you know, we're seeking, you know, female domination, or that the battle has already been won. And I think it's really important to have those conversations to highlight the more covert forms of that bias that we're trying to break. And sometimes we don't even see it in operation. So for example, I was watching a TED Talk recently, and the researcher was essentially saying that there's a difference in the questions that are asked to female founders versus male founders. And it even happens when the person, the VC that's asking the question is a woman. So they ask questions about, you know, retention and solving problems and that kind of thing to female founders, whereas the questions posed to male founders are more about growth and potential. And the difference in the questions produce a difference in the responses, obviously. And the effect is that more male-run startups are funded and are receiving more money, because obviously they're encouraged to speak in more positive growth terms by virtue of the questions that are posed. And those are the types of biases that we do not acknowledge, we may not readily be able to identify unless it's pointed out. And I think we need to constantly have this conversation about gender mainstreaming across the board, so that we are identifying the issues, we're confronting them and genuinely addressing them. And that's why I place the emphasis on those informal barriers and not just the formal ones, because the formal ones will only address what is seen, but people's lived realities demonstrate that there are bigger challenges, and challenges that still, the fight is not done, the fight has not been won. And I think we have to also develop a culture of allyship, because often when you speak of gender, people assume that it's just all about female and it's this burning feminism, and sometimes people put their backs up to it. And I say people because it's not just men, also women sometimes put their back up to it and don't want to be associated with that brand of progress, right? And I think that we have to deconstruct the issue, and we have to help people to understand that there's so much more to gender, and there's so much more to gender mainstreaming, and that is not a benefit for a subsection of society, but it really is a benefit for all of society. So I think that there has to be a bottom up change in culture and an understanding of the imperative.
If I can jump in, I agree with everything Shadi said, so I'm not going to repeat any of what she said. Women need voice, they need choice, and they need safety. And the voice is the ability to participate in the public sphere, not just in parliaments, but in all aspects of the life. And I think that that is something that's happening in the Caribbean. It's not happening at the pace that we want, but it's definitely happening. And they need choice, which means that you have the autonomy and the capacity and capabilities to be involved in the public life and in the private sphere in any way you want. So removing all of the structures of discrimination and the formal and informal, the visible and invisible barriers, what we've been talking about, I think that's really important. And of course, the safety, that we should be able to navigate the public space and the private space, the home and the community, without fear that we will be violated, which is a very, very present and real thing all across the Caribbean. So I want to agree that we have to, we've, across the Caribbean, we've done a really good job in eliminating discrimination for the most part in law and in policy, but the culture is not pace to pace with the legal development. So we still have the gender stereotyping, the sex stereotyping, this view of what is appropriate for women, for men. We still have all of that gender expression, gender identity, sexual orientation, discrimination, which is very much linked to gender inequality. So all that continues, and this is work we have to double down, and everyone has to be involved in it. But I want to say a little bit more than that. I think when we have our voice and we have the choice, we also have to take on the whole thing. Again, it's not just about having more women. It's about women using their agency to reimagine the world where more people are experiencing a decent quality of life and security rather than a few people. That we have to be thinking about how do we use our power to articulate a vision of redistribution. Yeah, ecological balance, environmental sustainability. This is the moment that the world needs all of our energies and women's energies to do that reimagining. I mean, Dame Billy spoke about, I believe it was, if the president of Russia was a woman, would we be in this situation? I'm not saying that women are innately more peaceful than men. I'm not sort of deterministic about it, but certainly the nurturing, the culture we have as nurturers means that we have to be thinking a lot more about other people in the cared way, because that's that's part of the role, the traditional role of women. But we now have to take that understanding of nurturing and caring, that interdependence, that solidarity, and bring that to the public space and public policy, which is what I think we're doing here in this conversation, trying to reimagine trade policy that is redistributive, that takes us to social justice, and still keeps us safe from, unalterable climate harm. So yeah, I mean, the breaking the ceiling, however you characterize it, glass or concrete or what, it requires that we are all involved. And not just we. Shadi talked about allyship, I think you said, Shadi. And it is for all people, because this cause benefits everyone, boys and men as well. So yeah, we have to just keep plugging on and be hopeful and optimistic and determined. We can't at all be cynical or, pessimistic. It's not the time for that.
Positive way forward only. Rita, I saw you had your hand raised. You can go ahead.
Yeah, just a very quick intervention here. We're talking about gender mainstreaming in the trade policy context, and we understand that it has become a very important issue that has come to the forefront, especially in the last few years. One issue that I would like to sort of add to this debate and bring on the table is a continuation to what Commissioner Clark mentioned, and Commissioner Clark's effort to define gender justice, which is a very broad, vague, and ambiguous term. None of the trade agreements today, as we speak, define gender equality or gender justice, but they go on using legal provisions where the parties or the countries assume commitments on promoting gender equality or ensuring gender justice. And that has become a huge problem. It has become a major problem because it has led to hesitations of developing countries, because developing countries have looked at these provisions that are being sort of imported and or exported to developing countries without any regard for their social context or domestic context. And they are apprehensive of such provisions because they are not defined and the scope is not limited. What do we mean by gender? Are we only referring to cisgender, so the gender allocated to us on birth by doctors, or are we talking about gender more broadly speaking? And what kind of empowerment are we looking at? Economic, social, political, or are we looking at all forms of empowerment because they are intricately related to each other? Lack of definition of these concepts has added to actual fears of protectionism, that countries will use these provisions to reduce competitive advantage of developing countries and of countries that have a wider gender inequality issues in their domestic context. And these problems and these fears need to be addressed.
Thanks for that intervention, Amrit, and I completely agree with you. And it's these type of conversations that we want to have to ensure that we begin actually defining what gender justice, what gender equality, what it means, so that when we actually start to have gender sensitive trade agreements, we wouldn't be left confused, as you said, and we can target all of these systemic inequalities. And Vashti, you wanted to also give a comment as well?
Sure. There's some excellent questions in the Q&A, so I've been trying to address those. But again, I would have to say that we need to address the issue of confidence, because as well as what I see, and again, it's based on my experience with working with women under the Services Go Global and then Gateway to Trade, we have a tendency as women to overthink things. So whereby we would evaluate and assess 100 reasons why we should not do or what something, or what are the consequences. And whereas when I look at the men, they are not fearful of failure, or they see failure as a stepping stone. So those are some things in our psyche that we need to address.
Thank you so much for that, Vashti. And thank you as well for responding to the individuals in the chat, because there's so many questions, but unfortunately we do not have the time. So maybe sometime in the future we would have a follow-up. And this is definitely an area that we'll be writing on at the SRC, led by our director who's passionate about the area. So what I want to do at this time is thank all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules, because we know each of you are powerhouses in your respective fields, for sitting here with us, myself and the viewers included, and really having a thought-provoking discussion on gender and trade and what it really means. And I really do pray it doesn't fall on deaf ears, because what we've discussed here today is relevant and it's necessary for an equitable tomorrow and for a sustainable future. So thank you all once again, not only for today's discussion, but for paving the way for other women to come. As the saying goes, if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants, and that's giants like yourselves in your respective fields. So thank you once again, panelists, and thank you to our viewers. A special thank you to our technician, Mr. Samuel Jean, and to the SRC Director, Dr. Johnny Remy, and SRC Research Fellow, Ms. Alicia Nichols, for making this possible. I'll now hand back over to the Director, Dr. Johnny Remy.
Well, Chelsea, as you can see, we have young upcoming powerhouses at the SRC. She did all the closing for me. Let me just take the opportunity, as Chelsea did, to thank everyone who made this village happen today. I want to thank those from my staff at the SRC, Alicia, Chelsea, Tanil, Andre, all of those who worked really hard to put this on. I know it's not okay to thank your own staff, but I really do want to thank them for making this happen, and all of the beautiful things that you see on this table and all of the beautiful questions generated as well. I want to thank our IT experts. I want to thank Jermaine Atwell, who helped with putting together a lot of the tribute to Dame Billy. I want to thank those who participated in the video production. Really a testament to Dame Billy. I want to thank Dame Billy for being here as an example and for, as I said, gracing us with her presence and always supporting the SRC. I wanted to close also with a couple of, and I wanted to thank also, of course, the panelists, without whom none of this discussion would have been possible, and to our avid SRC supporters and audience today for once again turning up and being here with us. I wanted to actually thank the panelists, and I'm going to close on this, for raising some real issues. The discussion for me was real. We took the lofty discussions about the declaration and you personalized it to all of the audience who can listen and actually understand some of these broader context discussions that are happening at the WTO and what it really means for us women in the Caribbean. I think you also broke the bias. What do I mean? There's a lot of bias around just talking about women's issues. I think there's a big problem that we've seen, and I saw it recently, and I want to say that people often say that women have gotten to where they need, and we need to look at others in society who are equally vulnerable. I don't think the discussion we have today comes at the expense of broader social ills that continue to pervade society. So us speaking as people concerned about women issues doesn't come at the expense of others. And secondly, I think we proved today that gender and trade are important discussions to have. So what is the relevance of gender in trade and trade in gender? I want to thank my students in cohort 19 who were part of the guinea pigs for the Women and Trade in the Americas webinar that we had, where we started to think about how the Caribbean and Latin America can do more in mainstreaming gender. I want to also encourage you to turn out tonight for a discussion that the Caribbean Women in Trade is having with Ms. Miriam McIntosh on accessing finance. That's the first step to trade, is to actually access finance. And I want to encourage all of you to continue caring about these issues, because ultimately women and trade translates into better societies, more developed societies, and an inclusive development agenda. So thank you all. Keep watching the SRC, keep supporting us, and have a wonderful Women's Day and break the bias any way you can. Thank you all. Goodbye.